International news now.
So the conflict in Syria began in 2011 during a wave of rebellions that spread rapidly across countries in the Middle East. Many long-standing governments, such as those in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, were toppled in the face of mass public demonstrations and sometimes armed conflict. In Syria, there were popular protests against the government of President Bashar al-Assad. Now, the Assad government responded with significant force that sparked an armed battle between rebel groups and the government. The civil war that ensued has killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians and displaced millions. It has also resulted in a failed state and a fragmented country in which various groups, the Syrian government, rebel groups, and ISIS, each control portions of the country. Now, Syria has long been divided internally along sectarian and ethnic lines. These divisions both set opposing sides in the civil war and have complicated subsequent attempts for a peaceful resolution. The Assad family has principally drawn its ruling coalition from Alawites in the western portion of the country. However, they make up at most about 15% of the country's population. Now, this means that Syria has long been ruled by a minority group. Democratic rule there would undermine the privileged political position of the Alawites, like it has done for the Sunni Baathists in Iraq. Consequently, Assad has limited political participation in Syria and relied on brutal authoritarian means to remain in power, particularly since the civil war began. Now, some religious similarities between the Alawites and Shiite Islam have fostered an alliance between the Assad regime, Iran, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Military support from Hezbollah and Iran has played a significant role in helping to prop up the Assad government during the civil war. Now, in addition to the Alawites, Syria is also composed of Sunni Arabs, which make up about 70% of the population, and Sunni Kurds, which make about another 10% of the population. Now, since 2011, the civil war has become internationalized, with various outside countries becoming involved and supporting different sides of the conflict. The Syrian government is supported by Russia and Iran, mainly. These two countries have provided materials and military support, including airstrikes and some ground forces, to help the Syrian government remain in power and combat its enemies. The rebel groups opposing the Assad government have principally been supported by the United States and its allies, particularly Turkey and Arab countries like Saudi Arabia. These countries have provided materials and airstrikes to help the rebels battle the Syrian government. Now, the United States and Turkey have long disagreed over the status of the military of the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, or the Kurdish People's Protection Units. In fact, earlier this year, the U.S. had to insert troops between Turkish troops and the YPG in northern Syria to help keep the peace between these two factions. The Turkish government, though, views the YPG as an ally of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. And the United States and Turkey have both designated the Kurdistan Workers' Party as a terrorist organization. Now, the PKK is fighting the Turkish government for greater political autonomy. So the Turkish government worries that if Syrian Kurds grow strong in military terms through the war against ISIS, then the PKK will grow stronger as well, which would then pose an even larger military and political challenge to the Turkish government at home. Now again, remember the logic of the commitment problem here. The U.S. wants the YPG to participate in the larger battle, now successful to retake Raqqa from ISIS. And so it supplied the YPG with significant military aid. But the Turkish government pushed back and resisted to this because it's concerned about how the YPG could then strengthen Kurds within Turkey that might revolt against the Turkish government. Finally, we want to emphasize here that this conflict in Syria is about which groups will possess political control over Syria. A number of outside parties are participating in the Syrian civil war because they have a stake or a political interest in that question about who will rule in Syria in the future. For example, the Russian government wants Assad to remain in power. The Turkish government wants to prevent the Syrian Kurds from controlling significant portions of territory along its southern border. So the Turkish government wants to prevent the Syrian Kurds from having a privileged position of power within Syria. Now, the steady escalation and intervention by outside actors in this civil war, including by ISIS, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and the United States, has continually created new shifts in the distribution of power in Syria, and as a consequence has helped to sustain the conflict by aggravating this commitment problem.
All right. Sorry. Okay, let's take a step back and look at how ISIS and now its demise fits into all of this. ISIS emerged out of the chaos and political vacuum of a broader civil conflict between rival ethnic and religious groups in Syria and Iraq. Specifically, the Sunnis, as we already said, which are a religious sect within Islam that were the dominant group under Saddam Hussein in Iraq, were politically marginalized in the new Iraq that became dominated by the majority Shiites, another rival Islamic sect. Some Sunni groups took up arms against both the United States, which intervened against Saddam Hussein's regime, and the new Iraqi government. Sunni rebels first joined al-Qaeda in Iraq and fought an intense civil war in the mid-2000s. American military efforts temporarily subdued this uprising. The most prominent of these efforts was the Surge, a strategy by the Bush administration that centered on an increase in American military presence and co-optation, and this is very important, of local Sunni leaders to fight with the Americans and the Iraqi government against the Sunni rebel groups. So they tried to co-opt local Sunnis to fight against the Sunni-led radical groups. However, the withdrawal of American forces under President Obama arguably led to a resurgence in fighting as the majority Shiite government, backed by Iran, brutally cracked down on dissent from the Sunnis, which made radical groups claiming to protect Sunnis from Shiite persecution more attractive. Moreover, the civil wars in neighboring Syria and Libya created additional political vacuums in which a reconstituted ISIS could emerge out of al-Qaeda in Iraq. So this is the evolution here. ISIS comes out of al-Qaeda in Iraq as an even more powerful entity. The new organization was more violent and radical in its aims than al-Qaeda in Iraq and quickly took over large parts of Syria and Iraq. And so out of the chaos and the civil war in Iraq, and this new radical organization, ISIS, that differentiated itself by taking territory. Most disturbingly, the Iraqi army that the United States trained to take over security in Iraq largely retreated in early battles against ISIS in the summer of 2014, despite often overwhelming numerical superiority. So that is a brief summary of the origins of ISIS. What about the response to ISIS by the United States and other countries? Here, the main point to emphasize is that the challenges of confronting ISIS are magnified by complicated regional politics in the Middle East. Many actors in the region agree on one thing, and that is that ISIS needs to be defeated. They're on the side of the United States. This includes Russia, the Syrian government under Assad, Kurds, Iran, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq. All these entities and other regional powers have mobilized against ISIS. It's a broad coalition. It includes regional actors, but also world powers, the United States and Russia. And this is one of the main reasons that ISIS has suffered such significant military losses in Iraq and Syria. But it is also why the next stage in the conflict will be so complicated. The fight over Iraq and Syria will not end with the demise of ISIS. These actors were united around only one thing, a common enemy in ISIS. And now that this enemy is quickly disintegrated, they are turning on each other in a fight to fill the vacuum of power and determine the settlement that comes after ISIS is gone, or at least no longer controlling territory. Each of the countries fighting on the side of the United States against ISIS has its own agenda, and this agenda does not necessarily match up with U.S. interests. So let's take a look at a few of these countries to explain why the situation after the fall of ISIS will be so complicated. First, there is Iran. Because ISIS is a Sunni-led group and threatens the Iraqi government, which is now close to Iran because it is a Shiite-dominated government, Iran has an interest in defeating ISIS. In fact, Iran and the United States have cooperated somewhat in battling ISIS already. But of course, Iran does a lot of other things in the region that the U.S. hates, such as sponsoring terrorist organizations like Hamas, threatening Israel, supporting the Assad government in Syria, which we want out of power because for one reason, because it used chemical weapons against its own citizens. And so Iran is not really a good partner for the United States against ISIS, even though of the common interest that it shares in trying to defeat ISIS. This is becoming glaringly obvious now that ISIS is on its way out. Two other potential partners for the United States against ISIS are Turkey and the Kurds, which is another ethnic group in Iraq. We have already talked about the conflict between Kurds and the Iraqi government when we covered the battle over Kirkuk in Iraq last week and the referendum for Kurdish independence from Iraq. A similar situation applies to the relationship between Turkey and the Kurds. Remember the role played by power shifts in the continuation of a civil war from Module 13. Here, Turkey is concerned that the war against ISIS is strengthening Kurdish military, as we already noted, potentially helping them to cohere into a single robust alliance that could then try to carve out an independent Kurdistan with territory from Turkey. Turkey is fighting against ISIS in part to prevent significant territorial gains for Kurdish forces. Now, surprisingly, despite all these complications, the anti-ISIS coalition has effectively won the ground war against ISIS. This is a big deal. It shouldn't be lost on us in anticipating the new struggle that is emerging. It's a major accomplishment of U.S. foreign policy. What made ISIS unique, its ability to hold territory, is essentially over for now. This was a huge recruiting tool, the caliphate and holding territory, that attracted a lot of foreign fighters. It also provided valuable resources for the organization through oil revenue and taxation. That's should subside now.
And I just think it's important to emphasize, given what we often hear about in the news and what we heard in the political campaign, the U.S. is winning the war against ISIS, the broader international coalition.
And that's shocking. I mean, that's incredible.
It's pretty significant,
Yeah.
but we're not really talking about it in larger public policy debates because there's other more pressing issues, I guess. But unfortunately, this victory doesn't end the fight, but simply raises new dilemmas. And we already highlighted the regional conflicts between former alliance partners who are quickly becoming adversaries in their quest for power in the post-ISIS Iraq and Syria. And so now we're going to look at three other problems through a series of video clips from Vox on what comes after ISIS. So let's go ahead and roll the first clip.
The terrorist group ISIS is losing. At the end of 2014, it claimed a territory the size of Great Britain and a population of 11 million people. But today it's lost about 60% of that, and its population is down to about 2.5 million. It's the result of fighting its enemies on all sides. To the west and north, ISIS is fighting armed rebel groups and the Russia-backed Syrian military and its allies. It's also fighting Turkish troops and US-backed Kurdish forces in the north. And to the east and south, there's the US-backed Iraqi army. It was this Iraqi army that delivered the latest blow, when they took over ISIS's biggest city, Mosul, the group's capital in Iraq. It was a symbolic loss. Mosul is where the group declared a caliphate, or Islamic territory, in 2014. This set them apart from other terrorist organizations. They weren't just a network of jihadists strung out across several countries like Al-Qaeda. They governed actual territory, which they called the Islamic State. Now with the loss of Mosul, the fall of this ISIS caliphate seems imminent. So what happens when ISIS is gone?
So problem number one is that these fighters are going to want to go home. So in 2014, when ISIS captured a huge swath of territory in Iraq and Syria, tens of thousands of foreign fighters came from all over the world to join the caliphate. According to UN estimates, as of July 2016, there were upwards of 30,000 foreign fighters. So most of these fighters came from countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, but hundreds also came from countries like Belgium, Germany, the UK, and even a few dozen from the United States. So these fighters were drawn to ISIS for all sorts of different reasons, but a big one was that it had actual territory and was supposed to be building a caliphate based on its own extreme interpretation of Islamic law. ISIS propaganda pushed this narrative in flashy, violent videos and magazines online, encouraging people from all walks of life, not just fighters, to come and help build this glorious Islamic state. And the people who came were not just young men, they weren't just fighters, there were women, children, and even families who came as well. But now, as ISIS's territory shrinks and the state that they tried to build collapses, anyone who survives will have to find somewhere else to go. And that's a major problem, because many of these people are now indoctrinated, they're now well-connected, and they're capable of carrying out deadly terror attacks. A similar dynamic actually happened back in the 1980s in Afghanistan. So thousands of foreign fighters flocked to Afghanistan to help the Afghan Mujahideen fight the Soviet invasion. And after the Soviets left, a lot of these fighters dispersed to various different theaters of jihad, including Bosnia, Chechnya, Somalia, Sudan, and elsewhere. These fighters ended up forming a loose network of transnational jihadists, most of whom had links to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, thanks to their time fighting in Afghanistan. And some of them actually went on to carry out attacks against the West, including attacks against the United States. So the worry now is that ISIS fighters will do something similar, but this time they might actually make it home to places like Europe and launch attacks there.
Okay, so let me make a couple of points here. The threat here is that ISIS returns to its insurgent roots rather than concentrates on holding territory in Iraq and Syria. And so then it launches attacks abroad in neighboring countries and the United States and Europe. And this evolution has arguably already begun with an uptick attacks in Great Britain in particular. There's also a fear of a boomerang effect. Foreign fighters flooded into Syria and Iraq to join the fight to establish a caliphate there. That fight is now largely over, and they have to go somewhere else. Many are likely to return home and can easily cross borders because they are citizens with passports from their home countries. But they've been indoctrinated by ISIS, and they have training and incentives to carry out other attacks. Moreover, ISIS as an organization has incentives to launch foreign attacks as well to remain relevant and try and attract more followers. So ironically, the military victory in Syria and Iraq may increase rather than decrease the likelihood of new terrorist attacks being perpetrated by ISIS abroad, outside of the region.
Okay, so secondly, the United States faces a dilemma as it decides what to do next now that ISIS is largely defeated militarily. And we have another clip from Vox on the trade-offs involved in that decision and what to do next in terms of foreign policy for the United States.
So the second problem is what to do with the U.S. military after ISIS falls. Right now, the U.S. is helping local forces in Iraq and Syria to defeat ISIS. There are currently around 1,000 U.S. troops in Syria and around 6,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. Mosul, which was ISIS's capital in Iraq, has fallen, and right now the U.S. is helping Syrian local forces to defeat ISIS in Raqqa, its so-called capital there. So as those two cities fall, ISIS has been spreading out to rural areas. The Trump administration has two choices. Option one is to keep the U.S. troops there, which would leave them in harm's way. Or option two is to bring them home, which increases the risk that the region breaks out into war again. Option one is a big political risk for Trump. He promised during the campaign that he would not get involved in foreign wars, that he would actually invest American money and time at jobs and resources in the United States. And so if Trump were to keep troops in the region, he would be admitting that he's going against the political philosophy he espoused during the campaign and currently during his presidency. Option two is definitely also a risk for Trump. If U.S. troops were to leave, that opens a space for sectarian violence to break out in the region. Let's take a look, for example, at what happened in 2011. When the Obama administration took most of its troops out of the region, that gave the Shiite government in Baghdad the space to crack down on Sunni populations throughout the country. And ISIS took advantage of that. ISIS was seen as the defender against the Shiite government and was able to gain support and allowed for its rise to continue. So while it doesn't necessarily mean that if troops leave, an ISIS-type group or ISIS 2.0 itself would grow out of that absence of U.S. troops, but that risk certainly exists.
Okay. So the Trump administration faces a crucial trade-off here. On the one hand, candidate Trump campaigned against long-term military interventions, criticizing in particular the Bush administration for launching the war in Iraq, but also arguing against intervention specifically in Syria, which he would have to be contemplating now, and Libya, when we led a effort to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi. Staying involved in the Syrian civil war goes against these campaign promises, and it's an interesting dilemma he faces here. He's quite sensitive to trying to fulfill these campaign promises, but and it also risks creating the potential for an open-ended commitment in Syria that could be a quagmire of sorts for the United States, where victory is poorly defined and there's no exit strategy. But the lessons of American withdrawal from Iraq suggest that this could create a vacuum of power, as it did in Iraq, that could result in a return of Sunni insurgency, as well as opportunities and the replacement of ISIS with just another similar type of radicalized group. Moreover, besides that high-stakes equation of whether to stay or not, there's other complicated cross-pressures facing the United States, even if it decides to withdraw, especially if it decides to withdraw in stages. And this involves competing allies that have their own conflicts with each other that present difficult choices for the United States. So what are we going to do about the Kurds? How would our decision about either standing by the Kurds or not affect Iraq's territorial integrity, since the Kurds have expressed their preference for independence? How would that same support or lack of support affect our relations with Turkey? Looking forward, abandoning the Kurds has its own risks associated with it. So you might say, well, we're in a difficult spot. We have to keep Iraq together. We have to satisfy a NATO ally in Turkey. That comes with costs, and one of those costs might be to manage or abandon the Kurds. But what happens if we withdraw from Iraq and have to return because there are new threats that emerge in the political vacuum that we leave behind from such a retrenchment? And if that occurs, what happens when we need, again, local groups and partners to fight on the ground against any new threat, and return to the Kurds, for example? They will be wary to partner with the United States if we abandon them after the fight is over right now. And so there's a commitment problem there as well. Finally, American retrenchment presents opportunities for adversaries like Iran and Russia to try to push the United States out of the region. Republican hardliners on Russia, like John McCain and Marco Rubio in the Senate, have long argued that the Trump administration has a blind spot when it comes to Russia on many issues, but in particular about its role in the Syrian civil war. Russia has already made it very difficult for the United States to push Syrian President Bashar al-Assad out of power, even though that was the central policy of the Obama administration. It is largely off the table now. Some commentators fear the United States may pull out of the region and let Russia and Iran expand their influence at the cost of U.S. prestige, leadership, and the like.
Let me say one other thing about the domestic political risks of pulling back and declaring victory over ISIS. And we see this in both Obama's term, but then in President George W. Bush's term. And so Obama in 2013 and 14 calls ISIS the JV team, which effectively downplays the threat, which then becomes a huge domestic political issue in the 2016 presidential campaign. And so there are huge risks associated with saying, we've got the threat of terrorism covered, we don't have to worry about this. The same thing happens when, this is Robert just mentioned, with respect to President Bush in 2003. In the summer of 2003, he gives this big speech on an aircraft carrier, I think, declaring mission accomplished. The U.S. had defeated the conventional forces of Saddam Hussein, with the implication the troops were going to come home soon, and this is a foreign policy success. Huge cost for doing this, because then Iraq devolved into a civil war. Now, what does all this mean in the context of President Trump? The terrorist threat is unique, different, because you can defeat terrorist forces on the conventional battlefield, which is what the allies and the coalition has done. But then terrorists can still pose a threat to your civilian population, because they can still fly somebody over on a plane and undertake a terrorist attack. So if you declare victory and say, we don't have to worry about this anymore, and then they strike again, you face significant domestic political costs from, you missed this, you left the American people vulnerable. This can create then, in a sense, a status quo bias. And this is the domestic politics of looking weak or not confronting threats from adversaries around the world. This can create a broader political status quo that presses Republican and Democratic presidents, no matter what they said in a presidential campaign, to maintain troops on the ground so they can look like they are protecting American people from this potential threat that could emerge. And so this is something that's different in an age of terrorism that complicates the politics of engineering real significant pullbacks of the broader projection of American force that has played out since 9/11.
The thing about the Congress here, I mean, they're facing increased pressures to get back into the game, right? The most recent issue that emerged with the deaths of 4 soldiers in Niger showcased how little they know about American military missions around the world, trying to undermine and support actions in foreign governments against terrorist groups. And so John McCain has been pressing hard to get more information and about the mission itself. I mean, it's kind of astounding that the Foreign Relations Committee doesn't.
And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff comes out yesterday and gives a really significant press conference where he said, basically, we've been quiet because we didn't know what happened. It took a long time for us to figure out what's going on. This would happen. Initially, it was reported that the troops were under fire for half an hour before they got support from French air support. They were under fire for 2 hours. There were questions about how long soldiers were left behind, and now looks like special forces were deployed, and it took them 2 hours to recover Sergeant Johnson's body.
Right.
And what Rob is talking about, the larger issue is Congress is in the dark here. Senator McCain demanded a meeting with Secretary of Defense Mattis. Mattis came to try and clear some of this up, and there's a much broader outreach, and that was what happened in yesterday's press conference. Basically, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff committing, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to be transparent with the American public and with Congress about what happened in Niger.
So your comments here suggest that the real impetus is to stay rather than leave, but then there's also the potential risk there. I mean, there is no. I mean, even defining victory here is problematic, right? And much less of exit strategy. I mean, when does this end?
Well, I don't know, right? And this is the larger, potentially never, right? This is the larger grand strategic problems associated with fighting terrorism, because you're not fighting them on a conventional battlefield. And so declaring victory is so hard, because you get lone wolf attacks, and all of a sudden, right, if you get 15 or 20 people killed or 1 or 2 people even killed in your country, someone that came from one of these regions or fought for ISIS, then it's like, how did you miss this? Why were you pulling down troops? And you can imagine there are advisors in the president's head anytime there's a conversation about withdrawing. But the larger question then is, how does that shape America's position in the world? And how can we ever talk about pulling back from this really explosion of new commitments and troops on the ground all over around the world that have happened in the aftermath of 9/11?
And this is ironic for the Trump administration that has been, very aggressive in sort of its rhetoric, at least, of pulling back from these conflicts and arguing that these regimes, like the Assad regime, is a bulwark against this, and interventions were a disaster.
Well, and think about the parallel here, the challenges that Trump is facing, that Obama faced with respect to Afghanistan. And so both of them, Obama wins by criticizing President Bush for the focus on Iraq and ignoring terrorism, and that then leads to a much broader strategic review in 2009 over American policy in Afghanistan. What does Obama do? He escalates American troop commitment there, and there's suggestions now that he thinks that was a mistake, that he got talked into it, that he was frustrated with that decision. But guess what? The same thing happened with President Trump this year in Afghanistan. Right? Yeah. He campaigns that we're going to pull back from American commitments. We need to rebuild the United States at home. We've been too involved all around the world. Well, what happened? He got
reality.
Yeah, he got pressed into increasing America's intervention and commitment to defeating the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Right. And devolving that decision-making to the military to expedite that. I mean, it's
So both of them, this commonality between two very different presidents, Obama and Trump, suggests that there are some larger structural or strategic things that are constraining the autonomy or independence of Democratic and Republican presidents alike. All right, so let's continue with this conversation about what comes after ISIS. And there's a more abstract problem of the loss of territory for ISIS and how it relates to the strategy of ISIS. And so we're going to roll another clip on this issue that calls this the problem of ISIS transforming from a place to an idea. So let's roll that clip now.
A deadly California shooting rampage.
A lone gunman to pledge allegiance to ISIS.
Both incidents carried out by so-called lone wolves.
Problem number 3 is ISIS moving from a place to an idea. Up until now, ISIS had one goal: defend the territory already had in Iraq and the territory already had in Syria. The problem is it's on the verge of losing both. And when that happens, ISIS goes from being the kind of place people go to fight to being the idea that people fight for. And it's an idea that's compelling. It's an idea that its followers are willing to kill for, and that its followers are willing to die for. When it first came to power, people thought it's a group that has its own territory, it wants to control that territory, but it's not Al-Qaeda. It's not a terror group that wants to carry out attacks outside of its borders, in the West. That was proven tragically wrong in October of 2015.
This is the bomb ISIS claims they used to bring down the Russian passenger plane over the Sinai Peninsula.
In their online magazine, they posted photos of the bomb that they said had been used to blow up the plane. And that was a reminder of what was about to come. A wave of ISIS attacks that have killed hundreds of people in London, in Paris, in Nice, and have inspired attacks that have killed dozens here at home, in California and in Orlando. It's worth remembering that these are not always attacks carried out by people who are part of ISIS. In many cases, these are people who are radicalized in the countries where they lived. And that's the danger of the idea. Take what happened in San Bernardino, California, where a married couple killed 14 people. Or in Orlando, where a single shooter killed 49 people. In both cases, ISIS claimed responsibility, but in both cases, there was no connection between those people and ISIS. They got radicalized over the internet. ISIS has known that propaganda matters, and ISIS is really good at it. It has people all over the world who use English language, Arabic language, to have Facebook pages and Twitter accounts that are full of incredibly slickly produced videos. They're really compelling, and if you're someone predisposed to have that worldview, they can push you over the edge from just thinking that's an idea worth killing for to actually killing for it. ISIS takes it so seriously that it refers to these people as media operatives and says those media operatives are carrying out a form of martyrdom akin to killing, to literally killing for the cause. And at the end of the day, that's the hardest thing about ISIS. It can be beaten on the ground in Iraq and Syria. It is being beaten on the ground in Iraq and Syria. But it's going from being a place to an idea, and it is impossible to defeat an idea.
Okay, so let's make a couple of short comments here. And we've already noted that the loss of territory may change ISIS's strategy and refocus it on launching terrorist attacks abroad. The point here is a bit different and goes beyond ISIS-initiated attacks through foreign fighters and the boomerang effect. Instead, what this demonstrates is ISIS's power to inspire lone wolf attacks, which demonstrates how ISIS can mobilize these types of attacks through radicalization in social media of individuals with no ties to ISIS. So these terrorist-inspired attacks, which are particularly prevalent in the United States, entail a whole different set of challenges, since those perpetrating such attacks are not foreign fighters and have potentially no direct tie to ISIS. They get radicalized over the internet. And so the larger question becomes, how can the U.S. counter that?
And think about the travel ban here. I mean, the travel ban is really based on the presumption of ISIS-initiated attacks, right? Because it's really trying to combat some sort of boomerang effect. But the attacks in the United States really have not been perpetrated by immigrants, anybody coming from or even traveling to those regions. It's been perpetrated by those who were in the United States and through social media and the internet. And so it strikes me, at least, that this is a particularly vexing problem that really is a dilemma for, especially because it seems so indirectly related to foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, and the source of vulnerability here is really free and open societies, both in terms of political participation, your access to the complete range of opinions on social media, but also the freedom to interact economically how you want, right? Which shows up in forms of moving to different localities in the United States, picking the jobs where you're going to which you're going to take, or in terms of limited restrictions on your movement in and out of our country if you have a U.S. passport. All of these things, right? These are the dilemmas of open political and economic societies, and they simultaneously, in the current era, can make us more vulnerable to these attacks based on ideas.
And I'm not sure I agree with the final line of that video where you can't defeat an idea. It's impossible. I think that the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union suggests otherwise. That the contest shifts to one in which example or arguments are the currency of trying to defeat these. We haven't seemingly had much success in that. And what's really difficult is that the small number of perpetrators that it takes to unleash such incredible damage is problematic. You can persuade 99% of the people to not engage in this stuff. It only takes much less than 1% to bring down to bring a lot of destruction. So that's a hard lift.